History does not always announce its most dangerous figures with noise. Some arrive through conquest, spectacle, or inherited crowns. Others emerge quietly, shaped by instability, educated by crisis, and sharpened by opportunity. Zenobia belonged to the second kind. Long before her name unsettled Rome, before emperors measured her ambition as a threat rather than a curiosity, she was formed inside a world already beginning to fracture. The Roman Empire of the 3rd century was still immense, still wealthy, still militarily formidable, but it was no longer secure. Its borders were stretched thin across continents, its armies exhausted by constant redeployment, its political center weakened by relentless internal conflict. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. Loyalty was transactional. Authority was unstable. This period, later known as the crisis of the 3rd century, marked a turning point when Rome ceased to feel eternal even to itself. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty that Palmyra thrived. Palmyra was neither fully Roman nor fully outside Roman influence. Situated in the Syrian desert, it controlled vital trade routes linking the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia, Arabia, and beyond. Caravans carrying silk, spices, precious stones, and metals passed through its gates. Languages overlapped, cultures intermingled, wealth accumulated without conquest. Palmyra did not dominate through armies alone. It dominated through position. Its ruling elite understood negotiation better than submission and independence better than defiance. For generations, Palmyra maintained a careful balance with Rome. It paid tribute when necessary, provided stability along trade routes, and in return retained a remarkable degree of autonomy. Its leaders were not provincial governors waiting for imperial instruction. They were power brokers operating in multiple worlds at once. Zenobia was born into this environment. The precise details of her early life remain obscured, filtered through hostile Roman accounts and later legends. What survives suggests that she was born into a wealthy and influential Palmyrene family sometime in the mid-3rd century. Unlike most women of the Roman world, she received an extensive education. She spoke Greek fluently, was familiar with Egyptian culture and history, and had access to classical literature and philosophy. This knowledge was not ornamental, it was functional. Zenobia did not grow up confined to domestic life. She grew up among negotiations, legal disputes, and political calculation. In Palmyra, elite women were not invisible. They appeared in public inscriptions, participated in religious life, and exercised influence through patronage. Power was not equal, but it was visible. Zenobia learned early how authority was constructed, maintained, and justified. Later traditions claimed that Zenobia traced her ancestry to Cleopatra of Egypt. Whether this lineage was factual mattered less than why it was invoked. Cleopatra symbolized intellectual authority, cultural sophistication, and resistance to Roman dominance. By associating herself with that legacy, Zenobia was not merely asserting noble blood. She was shaping perception. In a world where legitimacy depended on narrative as much as force, identity itself became a political instrument. Zenobia's transition from elite figure to ruler occurred through her marriage to Odaenathus, the most powerful man in Palmyra. Officially, Odaenathus was a client ruler of Rome, granted extraordinary authority to defend the eastern frontier against the Persian Empire. In practice, he functioned as an independent monarch in all but name. When Roman emperors proved unable to secure the eastern provinces, Odaenathus filled the vacuum. He led successful military campaigns, defeated Persian forces, and restored stability to the region. Rome tolerated his autonomy because it depended on his effectiveness. Palmyra became indispensable. Zenobia was not a passive consort in this arrangement. Contemporary accounts describe her accompanying Odaenathus on campaigns, riding with soldiers, enduring the same conditions and observing command structures firsthand. She watched how armies were supplied, how loyalty was maintained, and how authority functioned under pressure. This experience mattered. It transformed her from an educated, elite woman into a political actor with direct exposure to power. Zenobia bore a son, Phabalithus, whose role would later prove central to her strategy. In an era where legitimacy depended heavily on continuity, a male heir was more than family. He was a stabilizing symbol. Through him, Zenobia could rule without appearing to usurp. Authority could be framed as preservation rather than disruption. In approximately 267 CE, Odenathus was assassinated under circumstances that remain unclear. His death created an immediate power vacuum. Palmyra lost its protector. Rome lost its most effective eastern ally. Persia remained a threat, and the official successor was a child. Zenobia moved without hesitation. She did not seize power openly. She assumed regency. She ruled in her son's name. The language of continuity was carefully maintained. From the outside, Palmyra appeared stable, loyal, and orderly. From within, authority had shifted decisively. Zenobia controlled military appointments, administration, taxation, and diplomacy. The army followed her because it trusted her competence. The elites supported her because she preserved their interests. Rome did not intervene because nothing appeared to have changed. That illusion was deliberate. Zenobia understood that Rome's power no longer rested in absolute dominance. It rested in perception, compliance, and distance. By maintaining the appearance of loyalty while consolidating real independence, she bought time. And time, in a collapsing empire, was the most valuable resource of all. By the time Rome would recognize Zenobia as a threat, her authority was already complete, and Palmyra was no longer merely a city. With authority consolidated inside Palmyra, Zenobia turned her attention outward. Stability alone was not enough. In a world where power shifted rapidly, survival required expansion, or at the very least, control over the conditions that made expansion possible. Zenobia understood that Palmyra's greatest strength lay not only in its army, but in its geography. Whoever controlled the eastern trade corridors controlled wealth, supply lines, and influence far beyond the battlefield. Rome's eastern provinces were vulnerable. Garrisons were underfunded. Governors changed frequently. Communication with the imperial center was slow and unreliable. Zenobia did not challenge Rome directly. Instead, she began to act as if Palmyra were already responsible for regional order. Her forces moved first into territories that were technically Roman but practically neglected. These movements were framed as defensive measures, intended to protect trade routes and stabilize unrest. Local populations exhausted by uncertainty offered little resistance. In many cases, they welcomed Palmyrene administration as more efficient and predictable than distant. Roman oversight. Egypt soon became central to Zenobia's calculations. Egypt was not just a province, it was Rome's breadbasket. Grain shipments from the Nile fed the city of Rome itself. Control of Egypt meant leverage over the empire's survival. Zenobia did not invade impulsively. She waited for the right moment. When Roman authority in the region was weakest and local discontent strongest, when Palmyrene forces entered Egypt, the transition was swift. Roman officials were removed or absorbed. Administration continued with minimal disruption. Zenobia presented the change not as conquest, but as restoration. Order replaced neglect. Security replaced confusion. Egypt was incorporated into Palmyra's sphere with surprising speed. At the same time, Zenobia's public image began to change. Coins were issued that still acknowledged Roman emperors, but increasingly emphasized Palmyrene authority. Titles grew more ambitious. Language shifted subtly. Zenobia remained cautious, but the direction was unmistakable. Palmyra was no longer a loyal intermediary. It was becoming a rival center of power. This transformation was not accidental. Zenobia carefully cultivated legitimacy among diverse populations. She respected local customs and religions. She presented herself as a protector of tradition rather than a foreign ruler. In Egypt, she aligned herself with pharaonic symbolism. In the eastern provinces, she emphasized continuity and stability. Her rule adapted itself to the expectations of each region. Militarily, Palmyra evolved rapidly. The army became more professional, better supplied, and more disciplined. Cavalry units were expanded. Command structures were tightened. Loyalty was rewarded, incompetence removed. Zenobia did not romanticize war. She treated it as a necessary instrument of statecraft. Rome could no longer ignore what was happening. Reports reached the imperial court describing a woman ruling vast eastern territories, issuing coinage, commanding armies, and acting independently of imperial authority. What had once appeared as temporary regency now resembled sovereignty. Yet Rome hesitated. The empire was still divided, facing threats on multiple fronts. To confront Zenobia required focus, resources, and leadership Rome did not immediately possess. Delay worked in Zenobia's favor. Each month strengthened her position. Each successful administration reinforced the perception that Palmyra, not Rome, guaranteed stability in the east. Zenobia now ruled an empire in all but name. Her authority stretched from Syria into Egypt, from Anatolia toward Arabia. Trade flowed through her territories. Armies answered to her command. Diplomacy was conducted on her terms. She had achieved what Rome itself struggled to maintain: coherence. Still, Zenobia understood that this balance could not last indefinitely. Rome would respond. The question was not whether conflict would come, but when and under what conditions. Zenobia prepared accordingly. She strengthened fortifications. She stockpiled resources. She reinforced loyalty among her commanders. And she refined her narrative. She was not a rebel. She was a guardian of order in a failing imperial system. She was not opposing Rome's ideals. She was embodying them more effectively than Rome itself. This distinction mattered, because when confrontation finally arrived, Zenobia intended to face Rome not as a provincial insurgent, but as an equal. And in that intention lay both her greatest strength and her ultimate danger. By the time Zenobia's authority reached its widest extent, the fiction of Roman oversight had begun to thin. What had once been framed as temporary administration now functioned openly as sovereign rule. Palmyra no longer acted on Rome's behalf. It acted in its own interest, according to its own priorities, and under a single centralized command. This shift was visible not only in territory but in tone. Administrative language changed first. Orders were issued without reference to Roman approval. Legal decisions were enforced without appeal to imperial governors. Taxation was standardized under Palmyrene control. These changes were subtle, bureaucratic, and easily overlooked by distant observers. But they marked a decisive transformation. Authority no longer flowed outward from Rome. It flowed inward toward Palmyra. Zenobia understood that power required more than control. It required coherence. Her rule emphasized consistency across regions that differed radically in culture, religion, and political history. Instead of imposing uniformity, she imposed reliability. Local elites were retained where possible. Religious practices were respected. Stability became the unifying principle. Under her administration, regions that had suffered neglect experienced predictable governance for the first time in decades. This was not ideological tolerance. It was strategic intelligence. Zenobia did not attempt to erase Rome's presence from public memory. Roman law, imagery, and administrative forms were selectively preserved. This continuity reassured populations, accustomed to imperial systems while masking the reality that those systems now answered to a different center. The result was a hybrid political structure, Roman in appearance but Palmyrene in function. As her confidence grew, so did her ambition. Coinage provided one of the clearest signals of change. Early issues had emphasized cooperation, pairing Roman imperial imagery with local authority. Later coins shifted emphasis decisively. Titles expanded. Hierarchies were redefined. The visual language of subordination faded, replaced by symbolism that suggested parity and eventually independence. Zenobia herself became the focal point of this transformation. Her public image evolved from regent to ruler. She appeared in ceremonial contexts previously reserved for kings and emperors. She received envoys directly. She presided over judicial proceedings. These appearances were carefully staged. They projected calm, restraint, and inevitability rather than aggression. Zenobia did not present herself as a conqueror. She presented herself as the natural solution to imperial failure. Rome could no longer misinterpret these developments. The eastern provinces, once secured by compromise and delegation, had effectively slipped beyond imperial control. Reports reached the capital describing a ruler who governed Egypt, Syria, and much of the eastern Mediterranean with efficiency Rome itself struggled to match. The fact that this ruler was a woman only intensified the shock, exposing Roman anxieties about authority, tradition, and decline. Yet even then, Rome delayed. The empire remained divided, weakened by internal conflict and external threats. Confronting Zenobia meant acknowledging the extent of imperial vulnerability. It meant committing resources to a campaign, far from the center, at a time when unity was fragile. Delay appeared safer than action. For Zenobia, this hesitation was confirmation. She no longer framed her rule as provisional. The language of guardianship faded. Sovereignty became implicit. Her administration now functioned as an alternative empire, offering stability where Rome offered distance. At the same time, Zenobia prepared for confrontation she knew could not be avoided. Military organization intensified. Supply lines were secured. Fortifications strengthened. Commanders were selected for loyalty as much as competence. Zenobia understood that Rome's eventual response would be overwhelming. The empire might be fractured, but when unified under capable leadership, it remained formidable. She did not underestimate this. Instead, she recalibrated her position. Her strategy was no longer expansion, it was endurance. If Palmyra could survive Rome's initial assault, the conflict might fracture imperial resolve. Time, once again, was her most valuable ally. Ideologically, Zenobia refined her justification for rule. She positioned herself as a defender of order, tradition, and prosperity against imperial neglect. In her narrative, Rome had abandoned its responsibilities. Palmyra had assumed them. This framing appealed to elites and common populations alike, especially those who had experienced years of instability. Zenobia's empire did not define itself against Rome's values. It claimed to embody them more faithfully. This claim was dangerous. It challenged not only Roman authority, but Roman identity. If a peripheral ruler could administer, protect, and unify provinces more effectively than the empire itself, then Rome's legitimacy was no longer self-evident. It had to be enforced. The moment of coexistence was ending. Rome would soon respond not with negotiation, but with force. And when it did, Zenobia would no longer be judged as a regent, an ally, or even a rival administrator. She would be judged as an emperor in all but name. And Rome did not forgive those who mirrored its power too closely. Rome's response, when it finally came, was shaped as much by humiliation as by strategy. The eastern provinces had not simply slipped away. They had reorganized themselves under a ruler who mirrored imperial authority too closely. To be dismissed as a rebel, Zenobia had done more than seize territory. She had exposed weakness. This could not be ignored. The appointment of Aurelian as emperor marked a decisive shift. Unlike his predecessors, Aurelian understood that delay only strengthened rivals. He recognized that the fragmentation of imperial authority threatened Rome's survival more than any external enemy. The restoration of unity became his central objective. Zenobia was now directly in his path. Aurelian did not underestimate her. Reports described a disciplined army, secure supply lines, fortified cities, and a ruler who commanded loyalty through competence rather than fear. This was not an uprising to be crushed quickly. It was a parallel power structure that had to be dismantled systematically. The Roman campaign began with speed and precision. Aurelian moved east not as a conqueror seeking glory, but as a restorer seeking control. He avoided unnecessary engagements, choosing instead to isolate Palmyrene forces and cut off their mobility. Roman legions, hardened by years of internal warfare, advanced with renewed cohesion under unified command. Zenobia anticipated this approach. She did not rush to meet Rome in open battle. Her strategy relied on depth rather than confrontation. Fortified cities delayed Roman advances. Garrisons were instructed to hold, not to pursue. Time was meant to erode Roman momentum, stretching supply lines and testing morale. The first major clashes occurred in Asia Minor. Palmyrene forces, confident after years of expansion, encountered a Roman army operating at full imperial capacity for the first time in decades. The encounters were sharp and decisive. Aurelian's legions demonstrated discipline and adaptability. Palmyrene cavalry, once dominant, struggled against coordinated Roman formations. Defeats followed. Zenobia did not panic. She withdrew strategically, abandoning territory rather than risking annihilation. Cities were evacuated where necessary. Resources were preserved. The objective shifted from defense of borders to preservation of core strength. Syria became the critical theater. As Roman forces pushed deeper, the illusion of invincibility surrounding Zenobia's empire began to crack. Some regional leaders reconsidered their loyalties. Others hesitated, waiting to see which side would prevail. Zenobia responded with restraint rather than repression. She understood that fear created temporary obedience, not lasting loyalty. The decisive confrontation came near Antioch. There, Roman forces met Palmyrene armies in open engagement. The battle was hard fought, but its outcome reflected a structural imbalance. Rome's military system, refined over centuries, reasserted itself. Palmyrene forces, though skilled and motivated, lacked the depth to absorb sustained losses. Zenobia ordered a retreat. Antioch fell. The psychological impact was severe. For the first time, Zenobia's authority was visibly challenged. The momentum shifted. Rome advanced with renewed confidence. Each captured city reinforced the narrative of imperial restoration. Zenobia retreated toward Palmyra. This withdrawal was not a collapse, but it carried symbolic weight. The empire she had built, through careful expansion, was now contracting under pressure. What remained was the core, the city that had given her power, identity, and legitimacy. Inside Palmyra, preparations intensified. Defenses were reinforced, supplies rationed, communication tightened. Zenobia addressed commanders and officials not with promises of victory, but with clarity. The conflict was now existential. Survival depended on endurance. Aurelian approached Palmyra methodically. He understood its significance. Destroying the city would send a message far beyond the eastern provinces. It would signal that Rome's authority, though shaken, was still absolute. Yet he also recognized Palmyra's wealth and strategic value. He initially offered terms. Zenobia refused. For her, submission meant erasure. Acceptance of Roman mercy would reduce her to a footnote, a curiosity, a defeated anomaly. Resistance, even in defeat, preserved meaning. The siege began. Palmyra, surrounded by desert, held longer than expected. Its defenses were strong, its people disciplined. Zenobia's presence remained visible. She did not hide. She appeared among soldiers, maintained order, projected resolve. But endurance has limits. Roman pressure intensified. Supply routes tightened, morale frayed. The balance of time shifted again, no longer in Zenobia's favor. As the situation deteriorated, Zenobia made a final decision. She would not wait for capture. Under cover of night, she attempted escape, seeking refuge and potential alliance beyond Roman reach. It was a calculated risk, born of necessity rather than hope. She did not succeed. Roman forces intercepted her near the Euphrates. Zenobia was captured alive. The war was over, but the meaning of her defeat had yet to be decided. Zenobia's capture did not immediately resolve Rome's dilemma. Militarily, the conflict was over. Politically and symbolically, it had only begun. Rome now possessed the woman who had ruled the eastern provinces, commanded armies, and challenged imperial authority more effectively than any rival in generations. What to do with her would shape how the empire explained the crisis to itself. She was not treated as an ordinary prisoner. Zenobia was transported under heavy guard, but with a degree of restraint that reflected both caution and recognition. Executing her immediately would have been simple. It also would have been insufficient. Rome needed her alive, not for mercy, but for narrative control. Her existence had to be reframed, her authority dismantled not only on the battlefield but in memory. As she was brought westward, cities along the route observed her passage. Accounts describe a composed figure, physically weakened by exhaustion, yet mentally unbroken. She did not beg. She did not plead. She did not perform submission. This composure unsettled observers more than open defiance would have. Rome understood rebellion. It was less comfortable confronting dignity. The journey ended in Rome. There, Zenobia was prepared for display in Aurelian's triumph. The Roman triumph was not merely a celebration of victory, it was a ritualized rewriting of history. Enemies were reduced to symbols of disorder now corrected by imperial power. Kings were turned into trophies. Resistance was transformed into spectacle. Zenobia was meant to embody defeat. She was adorned with jewels, weighed down with gold chains, and paraded before the population. Rome intended to demonstrate not only her capture, but her containment. The woman who had ruled was now displayed as proof that Rome still decided who ruled. Yet the effect was not entirely what was intended. Ancient sources describe a crowd struck by her bearing. Even in humiliation, Zenobia appeared composed. The contrast between her dignity and the extravagance of her display created an unease that triumph was meant to suppress. She did not look like chaos subdued. She looked like authority constrained. Aurelian watched carefully. He had restored imperial unity through force, but he also understood the fragility of that restoration. Executing Zenobia would erase a threat, but it would also eliminate a reminder of how close Rome had come to fragmentation. Sparing her offered another possibility. It transformed her from rival into relic. Aurelian chose survival. Zenobia was not executed. Instead, she was granted a form of honorable captivity. Accounts suggest she was allowed to live in relative comfort, possibly in a villa near Rome, under surveillance but not imprisonment in the conventional sense. She vanished from public life, her power neutralized not by death but by removal. This decision was deliberate. Rome preferred defeated enemies who could no longer act, but could still be referenced. Zenobia's continued existence allowed Rome to claim magnanimity while preserving dominance. It also prevented her from becoming a martyr, a symbol around which resistance might reform. Palmyra, however, would not receive the same restraint. After Zenobia's capture, Palmyra rebelled once more. This second uprising removed any hesitation Aurelian had maintained. The response was swift and brutal. The city was sacked, its wealth seized, its political autonomy erased. Palmyra ceased to function as a center of power. The message was unmistakable. Zenobia had been an exception, not a precedent. Rome could tolerate an extraordinary rival once, It would not allow repetition. In Roman historical writing, Zenobia's story was reshaped accordingly. She became an anomaly, an exotic queen whose ambition exceeded her station. Her administrative competence, political intelligence, and strategic restraint were minimized. Her gender was emphasized as explanation rather than context. By framing her as an aberration, Rome avoided confronting the structural weaknesses she had exposed. Yet memory is never fully controlled. Zenobia survived not only physically, but conceptually. Later generations remembered her differently. Eastern traditions emphasized her justice and strength. Medieval writers reimagined her as a philosopher queen. Renaissance scholars admired her learning. Modern historians recognized her as a ruler who understood empire precisely. Because she had lived within one, her defeat did not erase her achievement. Zenobia ruled when Rome could not. She governed where empire had abandoned responsibility. She demonstrated that authority did not require the imperial center, only competence, legitimacy, and timing. Rome reclaimed its provinces, but it never fully reclaimed the certainty that empire was inevitable. And in that fracture, Zenobia's true legacy endured. After the triumph, Zenobia disappeared from the public record. This silence was deliberate. Rome had no interest in allowing her story to continue unfolding in the open. Visibility had once amplified her authority. Now invisibility was the final instrument of control. Ancient sources diverge on what followed. Some claim Zenobia died shortly after arriving in Italy, weakened by illness or despair. Others suggest she lived for years, granted a comfortable residence under imperial supervision, marrying into Roman aristocracy and raising children far from politics. The lack of consensus is itself revealing. Rome did not need her fate to be clear. It needed her to be irrelevant. What mattered was that she no longer acted. Zenobia's removal from power marked the end of Palmyra as a political force, but not the end of what she represented. Her absence created space for reinterpretation. Without direct action to anchor memory, later generations reshaped her image according to their own needs. In Roman narratives, Zenobia became a cautionary figure. She was portrayed as ambitious beyond her station, her failure presented as inevitable. Her competence was acknowledged only enough to heighten the glory of her defeat. Her gender was emphasized as anomaly, a deviation that proved the rule. By individualizing the threat, Rome avoided confronting the structural fragility that had allowed her rise. In Eastern traditions, memory followed a different path. There, Zenobia was remembered less as a rebel and more as a just ruler. Stories emphasized her fairness, her restraint, her defense of local autonomy against distant neglect. Her defeat did not erase the period of order she had created. For those who lived under her administration, Rome's return did not feel like restoration. It felt like loss. Centuries later, Zenobia resurfaced again, reshaped by distance. Medieval writers reimagined her as a philosopher queen, learned and moral, an example of wisdom constrained by fate. Renaissance scholars admired her classical education and political intelligence, seeing in her a reflection of antiquity's lost balance between power and reason. Each retelling softened the military reality and sharpened the symbolic one. Modern history approaches her differently. Without the need to moralize or mythologize, Zenobia appears as a ruler shaped by circumstance rather than destiny. She did not seek to destroy Rome. She sought to function where Rome could not. Her empire was not born of ideology, but of necessity. She governed because governance was absent. She expanded because fragmentation invited collapse. Her failure was not proof of impossibility. It was proof of scale. Rome could absorb rivals eventually, but Zenobia demonstrated that imperial authority was not inherent. It was constructed, maintained, and vulnerable. For a brief moment, she revealed that empire could be replicated from the margins. This realization lingered long after her disappearance. Zenobia did not leave behind a dynasty, a constitution, or an enduring state. What she left behind was precedent. She showed that legitimacy could be built without Rome's permission, that administration could replace conquest, that a ruler did not need to originate from the imperial center to act imperially. Her gender, so emphasized by ancient critics, was not incidental, but neither was it the explanation. Zenobia succeeded because she understood systems, timing, and perception. She ruled because she recognized opportunity before others recognized collapse. In the end, Zenobia's legacy does not rest in how she fell, but in how briefly and convincingly she stood. She ruled not at the height of empire, but at its fracture. And in that fracture, history glimpsed an alternative order, one that lasted only long enough to prove that Rome was not eternal by nature, only by force. Zenobia vanished from power, but she never fully vanished from history, because empires fear most those who reveal that their authority can be learned. Long after Zenobia disappeared from public life, the structures that had enabled her rise continued to shape the Eastern Mediterranean. Rome restored formal control, but restoration did not mean repair. The provinces were quieter, yet more closely watched. Administration became stricter. Autonomy narrowed. The lesson Rome believed it had learned was not how Zenobia had succeeded, but how to prevent another like her from emerging. Palmyra never recovered its former position. Once a hub of commerce and mediation, it became a warning embedded in stone. Trade routes shifted. Investment dried up. The city remained inhabited but no longer influential. Its decline was not accidental. Rome preferred weakened frontiers to independent ones. Stability achieved through centralization was safer than prosperity achieved through local power. Yet memory resisted this reduction. In the eastern provinces, stories of Zenobia persisted, passed through local traditions rather than official histories. She was remembered not primarily as a defeated enemy of Rome, but as a ruler who governed when others failed to appear. These memories did not require empire, they required experience. People remembered predictability, security, and fairness. They remembered administration that functioned. This distinction mattered. Official Roman histories framed Zenobia as an interruption. Local memory framed her as a solution. Over time, these parallel narratives drifted further apart. Roman authors emphasized her capture, her display in triumph, and her disappearance. Eastern retellings emphasized her justice, her discipline, and her refusal to submit easily. Each version revealed more about its authors than about Zenobia herself. By late antiquity, Zenobia had already become symbolic. Christian writers reinterpreted her within moral frameworks, sometimes portraying her as prideful, sometimes as admirable but misguided. Her pagan authority became a tool for theological reflection. Her empire became a lesson rather than a political reality. In the Islamic historical tradition that later developed in the region, Zenobia appeared again under different names and forms, often blended with local legends. She became associated with ruined cities, lost greatness, and the dangers of hubris. Yet even in these transformations, the core image endured. A woman who ruled decisively in a world that expected her silence. Modern historical inquiry approached Zenobia from another angle entirely. With access to archaeology, numismatics, and comparative administration, scholars began to see her not as anomaly, but as symptom. Her rise coincided precisely with moments of Roman weakness. Her methods mirrored Roman governance because she had learned within Roman systems. Her success exposed how thin the boundary between center and periphery had become. Zenobia did not invent an alternative to empire. She replicated empire where empire had failed to arrive. This insight reshaped her significance. She was no longer merely a dramatic figure in imperial decline. She became evidence that power was transferable, that administration could migrate, That legitimacy was not exclusive property of Rome. Her story also complicated assumptions about gender and authority in the ancient world. Zenobia was exceptional, but not inexplicable. She emerged from a society that allowed elite women visibility, education, and influence. Her rule was accepted not because she was extraordinary, but because she was effective. Opposition to her often intensified only when her success threatened imperial identity. This distinction challenges simplistic readings. Zenobia did not fail because she was a woman. She failed because Rome eventually concentrated sufficient force against her. Many male rulers met the same end. What distinguished Zenobia was not her defeat, but how long she delayed it, and how thoroughly she reorganized power before it arrived. In this sense, Zenobia belongs less to the story of collapse than to the story of adaptation. She adapted Roman systems to non-Roman control. She adapted imperial imagery to local legitimacy. She adapted military authority to administrative necessity. Her empire was not designed to last forever. It was designed to function now, and for a brief period it did. The endurance of her memory reflects this practicality. Zenobia remains compelling not because she dreamed of impossible futures, but because she demonstrated that alternatives already existed within the present. Rome endured, but it endured altered, more centralized, more suspicious, more aware of how close it had come to fragmentation. Zenobia's greatest impact may not have been the empire she built, but the empire she forced Rome to become afterward. Her absence did not restore innocence. It clarified vulnerability. And in that clarity, her shadow extended far beyond the years she ruled. By the time Zenobia's story reached its final form in history, it had already passed through many hands. Each generation that encountered her reshaped her meaning according to its own fears, desires, and assumptions about power. This process did not distort her legacy accidentally. It revealed the instability of historical memory itself. Zenobia existed at an intersection that made later interpretation unavoidable. She was a ruler without a traditional imperial title, a woman exercising authority in a militarized world, and a provincial leader who exposed the dependence of empire on its margins. None of these categories fit comfortably into Roman self-understanding. As a result, her memory could never remain neutral. For Rome, Zenobia represented a problem that victory alone could not resolve. She had not merely resisted imperial rule, she had replicated it. She governed provinces effectively, secured borders, stabilized economies, and commanded loyalty without direct authorization from the imperial center. Her existence demonstrated that Rome's authority was not an inherent property of the city itself, but a system that could be learned, adapted, and reproduced elsewhere. This realization was deeply unsettling. Empires depend not only on force but on belief, the belief that authority flows naturally from a single center, the belief that alternatives are inferior by definition. Zenobia undermined both assumptions. Her rule suggested that empire was a method, not a destiny, that governance could be transferred, that legitimacy could be assembled from competence rather than inheritance. Because of this, Roman narratives emphasized containment rather than understanding. Zenobia was described as exotic, excessive, and anomalous. Her intelligence was acknowledged only to heighten the drama of her defeat. Her ambition was framed as unnatural. Her gender was transformed into explanation. In this way, Rome reduced systemic failure to individual deviation. Yet this explanation never fully satisfied. The very care with which Zenobia's image was managed reveals how seriously she was taken. Lesser rebels were executed and forgotten. Zenobia was displayed, preserved, and then erased from public life. Her silence was enforced because her continued visibility risked reopening questions Rome preferred to close. Outside Roman official memory, Zenobia lived differently. In the Eastern Mediterranean, memory did not revolve around imperial legitimacy. It revolved around lived experience. Under Zenobia's rule, administration had functioned. Taxes had been predictable. Borders had been defended. Trade had flowed. For many communities, Rome's return did not feel like restoration. It felt like replacement by a more distant authority. This contrast shaped how Zenobia was remembered locally. She became associated with justice rather than rebellion, order rather than chaos. Her defeat did not negate her competence. It only confirmed the scale of the force arrayed against her. As centuries passed, Zenobia's image detached further from immediate politics. She entered literature, moral discourse, and philosophy. Writers no longer asked whether she had the right to rule. They asked what her rule symbolized. In this phase, Zenobia became less a historical figure and more a mirror. To medieval authors, she illustrated the dangers and possibilities of power. Some portrayed her as prideful, others as wise, but constrained by fate. These portrayals reflected medieval concerns about authority, morality, and divine order more than 3rd century realities. Renaissance thinkers encountering Zenobia through classical texts found in her a figure aligned with humanist ideals. Her education, multilingualism, and engagement with philosophy appealed to a worldview that valued reason and classical learning. She became an example of intellectual authority, a ruler who governed through knowledge as much as force. Modern historical analysis stripped away much of this symbolism, but not all of it. With access to archaeological evidence, inscriptions, coinage, and comparative administrative study, historians began to reconstruct Zenobia as a political actor shaped by circumstance rather than exception. Her rise coincided precisely with moments of Roman disintegration. Her methods mirrored Roman governance because she had been trained within Roman systems. Her success was possible because Rome had outsourced authority to local elites for generations. Zenobia did not appear suddenly. She emerged logically. This reframing changes the meaning of her defeat. It was not proof that her model was flawed. It was proof that Rome, when unified under determined leadership, could still reassert control. The difference lay in scale, not legitimacy. Zenobia's empire lacked the depth of manpower and resources Rome could eventually mobilize, but for a time it functioned as an imperial system in miniature. That alone was enough to challenge the myth of inevitability surrounding Roman dominance. Her story also forces reconsideration of how gender operates in historical narratives. Zenobia's authority was accepted locally because it worked. Resistance intensified primarily when her success threatened imperial identity. Gender became a rhetorical tool, not the root cause of conflict. This distinction matters beyond antiquity. Zenobia's legacy persists because it exposes a pattern repeated throughout history. When central authority weakens, governance does not vanish. It relocates. Peripheral figures step into gaps left by overextended systems. They borrow language, structure, and symbolism from the powers they replace. And when central authority recovers, it reframes those figures as anomalies rather than acknowledging dependency. Zenobia fits this pattern precisely. She did not seek to destroy Rome. She sought to operate where Rome could no longer function efficiently. Her ambition was not ideological rebellion, but administrative necessity. She ruled because someone had to. In this sense, Zenobia belongs not only to ancient history, but to a broader story of how power adapts under pressure. She demonstrates that empire is not a static entity, but a process maintained through continuous effort. When that effort falters, alternatives emerge, not from outside civilization, but from within it. Her ultimate defeat does not diminish this lesson. Zenobia did not leave behind monuments proclaiming her philosophy. She left behind a disruption in certainty. For a brief period, she revealed that authority could exist without Rome's permission. That legitimacy could be constructed from effectiveness. that the imperial center was not the only place where empire could happen. This realization lingered long after her disappearance. Rome survived Zenobia, but it survived altered, more centralized, more cautious, and more aware of its own vulnerability. The reforms that followed her rebellion were shaped by the knowledge that fragmentation was no longer theoretical. It had already happened. Zenobia's story ends without closure because closure would imply resolution. There was none. She vanished from public life, but the questions she raised never did. How much authority depends on distance? How much legitimacy depends on performance? How easily can power be replicated once its mechanisms are understood? Zenobia answered these questions not with theory, but with practice. And that is why her legacy remains unsettling, because she proved that empire is not immortal, it is only maintained. And when maintenance fails, others will step in, just as she did.